Do you have any experience yourself, Paul, of stress and burnout?
Yeah, I mean, 100% definitely stress. And I think with that comes an element of burnout. I've never been at a point where I've completely burnt out, and I'm thankful for that. But I have seen and recognised that in leaders that I've worked with, and indeed with colleagues. And I think the education sector that we're currently in as leaders and teachers and educationists is really challenging. It's one of those things that is constantly on people's minds, isn't it? How do we make sure we can still be there, show up every day, and be functioning, even though we are probably at the edge of that every day.
Yeah. And in your experience, what did significant stress look like in your staff?
I think in staff, it really depended for me on the different school climates that I worked in. I think, every school's got its own community, every school's got its own kind of microclimate and culture. And I can remember two schools distinctly because they're very, very different in terms of how staff presented in there. One school, obviously not naming any names of schools, but was very much about the stress that it was under because of the pressures to change and get better in terms of outcomes. And so the staff kind of were very much driven by the day-to-day improvements that they were being made to do or told to do or recognised they had to do. And that, had its relentless kind of effect on, I think, probably everybody, both from a sort of sense of tension and getting kind of a bit raggy with each other and a bit raggy with the kids as well. And then the kind of pressure that leaders felt on top of that. And it was very much what I would call a compressed set of expectations, very squeezed to the point where people felt like they had to show up and perform. Versus, another school I worked in that had gone through that stage and probably come out the other side in the sense that the culture had transitioned and shifted and people had been listened to and people had started to feel valued and the students equally were modelling the behaviours of the adults. It's that classic phrase from Paul Dix, when adults change, everything changes, and it genuinely had kind of meant that there was a bit of a lift, a moment of feeling that pressure go. And I think, we've always got to be mindful of that as leaders. If we're in those kind of environments, we kind of make our own weather, don't we? We are there being the umbrella for whatever's going on kind of outside.
Yeah, which in itself is a pressure for leaders, of course. But if we go back to how I opened with leaders functioning on adrenaline and whether that's a good thing or what is the impact of that in your experience, why do you think it's important to discuss that and to notice it?
I think as a leader, we're always at the point where we have to kind of show up every day. And I'm going to use the word perform because ultimately, when we've got things going on in our own lives, we kind of have to suppress that because we're there for the young people that we serve. And that's both from primary and secondary. And you're there for the staff that you lead if you're a leader as well. And I think you, by definition, suppress that sense of kind of stress or worry or whatever it is. And you put your best face on, your best mask on. And by that secondary definition, you're running on that kind of treadmill, that adrenaline fueled moment of where you're dealing with things. And because leadership and schools are you don't know what's going to happen in the everyday moment. And I love that about education. You go into a school and it's not like a regular 9 to 5. One day you could be being told by a young person how much they valued or loved what they've just done in a lesson versus the next day you're dealing with a school that's on fire in its worst scenario. Obviously, we don't ever want that to happen, and I'm thankful that's never happened for me. So I think that absolute spectrum of and degree of change is where that adrenaline probably comes from. I remember as a leader within the context of a really challenging school that I don't know whether I'd call it fortunate or unfortunate enough to experience a moment in leadership that you don't get trained for, that you don't necessarily know that's going to happen. You don't really get trained to be a head teacher anyway. I think it's one of those things you kind of fall into. But unfortunately, there was a moment of lockdown in the school where we got phoned by the authorities to say that somebody was coming to the school with a detonated device, a bomb, essentially, which is, a sort of thing you hear about on Waterloo Road and maybe a US film, not, not in a school in the UK. And it was legitimate. It was all over the papers and things, but you go into that sense of both protection, service in terms of what you're going to do, of course, adrenaline, and then in the back of your mind, that moment of, oh my goodness, what if? What if this does happen? And I think that's a really good analogy for every moment in the context of a conversation as a leader, because you have to go through those kind of thought processes of, okay, this is what's going on. This is where it's coming from. This is the moment in front of me. Now, what if? And I have to just, always ask myself, what am I doing to make sure that the person in front of me is getting the best they can out of me as a leader? And that's probably where I come from most of the time.
Yeah, I love that. But actually, what's coming to my mind is what you're saying is leaders are there, of course, to keep everyone safe, to ensure everyone is flourishing in the environment. And obviously, we're there for the children. But so, from my experience of burnout as a deputy head, I was looking after everyone else, children, families, colleagues. That was my passion. And I loved what I did, but I didn't see the warning signs in myself. And nobody else, well, my children did tell me I was working stupid hours and things, but really nobody highlighted to me the danger that they saw in me. So, what would you be saying to leaders who are in that sort of situation?
I think you have to model it. The most conscientious leaders burn first, don't they? The people that know themselves and show themselves how to deal with things like stress or burnout are the people that will be honest and authentic with the people around them, especially their leadership team. I think, me as an executive leader, head teacher, I had to have that sense of trust with my colleagues in terms of deputy heads, like you said, for yourself, or assistant heads. But you can't expect them to do what you do, be like you. We're all different. And I think you have to care in that way. You have to be holding yourself in that sort of mirrored lens and saying, well, I know I do this, but, and setting those boundaries, I think, are really important when you first go in as a leader, when you maybe are revisiting those contracting moments as a team in each year, in each, half term, whatever. I very often was very clear about saying I don't work at this time, or I don't do emails at this time, because actually I did in the background, not outwardly to the community or the team, but actually I didn't want people thinking that was the expectation of how they should work. And quite a lot of people will model what they see, won't they, and do what they see. And I think as leaders we have to recognise that and make sure we've got that containment around us as we're leading.
Do you have any other sort of particular top tips for sort of recognizing stress, managing stress? Because I was reading some research this morning that was showing that if you're overthinking, if you're on almost like that hamster wheel and you can't get off it, and I think a lot of us as leaders, we get so caught up in the sort of fierce pace of school that we don't take a moment to notice. And the research was showing if you notice, you can break that pattern. But I don't know, do you have any other particular tips you would say to people who are concerned about their stress levels or those of their team?
I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because what works for one person maybe doesn't work for another. And of course, there's the, what I would say are scientifically proven moments of meditation, of quiet reflection, of healthy eating, and all the things that go with it that are obviously going to add value. And I think you have to be really mindful of your own self and the trigger points that exist within you as a person. And you might know those straight away, or you might find those, you might unpack those as you grow in your leadership journey. I know I very much did that myself. I felt like I was the imposter in the room, that sort of moment of initial leadership versus 10 years on, where the leader that I am now is me versus the leader that I was thinking I had to be when I was, in my initial days of leadership. And I think, going through that journey allows you to work through the spaces, the time, the treats, the sort of reflection points, the moments of pause that allow you to function and do what you need to do as a leader. I know that I gave myself the ability to be coached, and that very much brought a sense of containment around the level of being able to perform, be a high performer, but at the same time use coaching not to gain that performance, but very much to give me that space to listen, that space to pause, and that space to stop and kind of understand where I was and where I was going ultimately, and the decisions that I was going to make, because every decision is going to impact how you feel, but equally how you lead.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? I wonder, do you think any leader ever feels good enough? Is that a mean question?
Yeah, that's a really interesting kind of question to pose, isn't it? I think every leader wants to be doing the best they can, because ultimately you lead, most people lead to gain that sense of kind of moving people forward and working with people, and that whole kind of efficacy that comes from making a change for the better. So I don't know, maybe that's not a very good answer, is it, to that question? I think it's a really hard one. I think that would be different for every single person.